Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are unpacking a staggeringly provocative contrarian argument. Seriously, we're looking at a source that makes a massive, almost unbelievable claim that mainstream Christianity has literally been deceived for centuries into following an apostle of Satan. We're going to map out this extensive, super complex theological argument strictly based on the source material, just to understand exactly how this wild case is built.
So here is the shocking central thesis the creator presents. They argue that the Apostle Paul, the guy who wrote a massive chunk of the New Testament, is actually a false apostle. I mean, if that's true, it completely upends thousands of years of mainstream Christian tradition. According to this view, Paul essentially hijacked the early church and led millions astray from the original teachings. It's a really heavy accusation, and to grasp it, we need to look at how this source breaks down the entire biblical narrative.
To really get this argument, we first have to understand the source's foundational concept, which they call the two Gospels or the two Messiahs. The source insists that the modern Bible essentially contains two competing, totally contradictory paths. On one side, you have the true, strict teachings of Yeshua, or Jesus, and his original disciples, and on the other side, an imitation, wide-road gospel taught by Paul. Our job today is to objectively map out the sprawling evidence the Creator uses to try and prove this massive divide.
To evaluate these claims, we're going to structure this explainer kind of like a courtroom trial. Here is our agenda. 1. Numerology and canon. 2. Contradictory conversions. 3. Prophetic red flags. 4. Character flaws. 5. Clashing doctrines. And finally, number 6, the ultimate choice.
Let's dive right in. Section 1. Numerology and canon.
The source kicks off its methodology by arguing that the modern Bible's very structure is inherently designed to deceive. Notice the intense focus on numerology here. The standard Protestant Bible has 66 books, right? Well, they explicitly link that to 666, the biblical mark of the beast. On top of that, they point out that the New Testament contains exactly 13 epistles written by Paul. The source argues 13 is historically associated with the occult and death, and they ask a pretty pointed question. Why would an infallible, divine book feature the numbers 66 and 13 so prominently, unless it was by deceptive design?
But the source doesn't just question the books that are in the Bible. They point heavily to what was deliberately left out. They argue that around the year 205 AD, a deliberate effort began to hide the real truth by ripping out specific texts meant for spiritual initiates. They point to missing writings like 2 Esdras, the Book of Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and specifically the Clementine Homilies. According to this creator, reading these excluded texts is literally the only way to clearly see Paul's deception.
Moving on to Section 2, Contradictory Conversions.
This is where the source brings in its first major piece of textual evidence by completely dissecting Paul's famous conversion on the road to Damascus. The crucial point here is that the source identifies 4 distinct versions of this event, 3 in the book of Acts and 1 in Galatians, and claims they hopelessly contradict one another. They point out discrepancies like, did his traveling companions actually hear a voice, or just a sound they couldn't understand? Did they see the light, or was it only Paul? In one version, the disciple Ananias plays a huge role, but in the version told to King Agrippa, Ananias is totally omitted. And did Paul start preaching in Damascus immediately, or did he wander off into the Arabian desert? The source uses these inconsistencies to paint Paul as a guy who constantly changed his story depending on who was listening.
And that illustrates one of the source's most provocative parallels yet. Paul claimed he didn't need to learn from the original apostles because Yeshua came down and taught him directly, one-on-one in the desert. Well, the source points out that Simon the magician, who is a universally recognized false teacher in early Christian history, made the exact same claim of direct, superior, one-on-one revelation. The creator argues that Yeshua explicitly warned believers not to trust anyone claiming to have seen him secretly in the desert.
Which brings us to Section 3, Prophetic Red Flags. The source strongly believes the Bible left behind identification markers to help us spot a deceiver. And according to them, Paul waves 3 massive red flags. First, Paul identified as a Pharisee, and Yeshua explicitly warned his followers to beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. Second, Paul was a Roman citizen, which the source ties directly to the prophesied beast system of Rome. And third, Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin. Drawing on an apocryphal text called the Testament of Benjamin, the source claims this specific tribe was prophesied to produce a ravenous wolf, tying this directly back to Yeshua's warning about a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Okay, Section 4. Character flaws.
Shifting from ancient prophecy to personal conduct, the source levels a really intense critique against Paul's character. They highlight a specific quote from Paul's letter to Philemon, where he says, "You owe me your very soul." For the source, this is a massively condemning statement. They argue that a true apostle would absolutely never claim ownership of another person's soul, suggesting this kind of arrogance perfectly mirrors the boasting of false teachers.
The explainer also contrasts their lifestyles using outside texts. The source points to the Clementine Homilies and the historian Josephus to claim that the true apostles, like Peter and James, were staunch vegetarians who lived in strict poverty with literally just one coat. Contrast that with Paul, who they argue ate anything, even food sacrificed to idols, and claimed he had this superior knowledge that allowed him to do so. The source actually views Paul's critique of people with weak consciences as a direct, passive-aggressive insult aimed squarely at Peter and James. Talk about ancient historical drama, right?
Let's look at Section 5, Clashing Doctrines. This brings us to the real climax of the source's argument, the core theological clash. On one hand, you have Paul, who allegedly teaches easy believism, the idea that the Old Testament law is completely torn down and salvation is achieved by faith alone. On the flip side, the source argues Yeshua taught that believers must strictly subdue sin and that salvation requires both faith and rigorous adherence to the commandments.
The source goes even further with this, arguing that Paul introduced unauthorized loopholes that practically amounted to sexual immorality. The creator asserts that Yeshua allowed absolutely zero exceptions for divorce and remarriage. But then Paul introduced a rule that if an unbelieving spouse leaves a believer, that believer is no longer bound. The source claims this single teaching by Paul opened the floodgates for the modern church to embrace a completely worldly approach to marriage.
Now, if you know this topic well, you know the ultimate defense used by mainstream Christianity is found in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, where the Apostle Peter explicitly endorses Paul's letters as scripture filled with divine wisdom. So how on earth does the source handle that?
Well, they claim the endorsement of Paul in 2 Peter is an outright forgery, secretly inserted by a later scribe. The source argues that if you literally just remove the verse praising Paul, the text actually flows way better. It moves straight from verse 14 to verse 17, creating a seamless, uninterrupted warning against wicked people. Plus, the source argues that Peter calling Paul merely a brother rather than a prophet or an apostle is actually meant to be a slight, not an endorsement at all.
And finally, Section 6, the ultimate choice. Having laid out all these arguments regarding canon, history, character, and doctrine, the source emphasizes that we as modern believers are actually held to a much higher standard of accountability than the early Christians were. Why? Well, because early Christians only heard fragments or single letters from Paul. Today, we have the huge advantage of collected texts. We can place Paul's 13 letters side by side with the Gospels, the Book of Acts, and the Apocrypha to objectively compare and spot what the source views as absolutely glaring contradictions.
And that brings us to the source's provocative final thought. After mapping out this entire contrarian case, the creator leaves the viewer with a really stark choice. Will you follow what they call the wide Roman road of Paul, a path of alleged easy grace and abandoned laws? Or will you choose the narrow, difficult path of Yeshua? Look, it's an intense, complex argument that definitely challenges mainstream perspectives. And whether you agree with it or completely disagree, it forces a really deep re-examination of these texts. So what do you think? Thank you so much for joining me today as we unpack this fascinating source material.